Hello, it's Debbie Potts, and I want to go into a continuation of a podcast I just recorded about metabolic efficiency, being fat adapted, and how to match your fueling with your training using different products as S fuels. There's UCAN, there's Retargo, there's Martin gels, but what is right for you? We also want to look at what you are eating throughout the day, nutrient timing, strategic carb timing. There's a lot to it we've been diving into on this podcast recently, but also the last 12 years. So lots of episodes, 550 plus episodes. You can go back and look at what we talked about being fat adapted 10 plus, well, it's 12 years ago we started. So lots to dive into, but just to recap some things we were just talking about on an interview I did with Dr. Mickey, talking about fueling plans and strategies. I just wanted to go over Endure IQ. Dr. Dan Plu's website has this great chart that we talk about. So how to implement carb timing according to your training, I want to touch on, but let's back up and go into what is metabolic flexibility. So NutriSense had a great article as well as Lumen, but what is metabolic flexibility? Just to review. So when you are metabolically flexible, easier for your body to switch, be flex to carbohydrates to fat. And you have a good metabolic flexibility. That means you're able to use the fuel from different macronutrient sources as carbs and fats. When you go long periods of time without any food, your body makes a number of internal adjustments, shifting gears to rely on different fat, fuel source, or glycogen, protein can break down into glucose. There's fatty oxidation. So we have different fuel sources available. Obviously, a lot of fat storage versus carbohydrate storage. I don't want to lose protein and use that as fuel source. So that's kind of why, yes, we don't need carbohydrates, but I don't want to also lose muscle because it's a battle as we get older. So research is needed. This article says early studies suggest that metabolically flexibility can be associated with better weight maintenance, increased energy, lower odds of developing metabolic disease, more consistent healthy glucose levels, improved sleep, and workout performance. Now, what is metabolic flexibility versus metabolic health versus your metabolism? Great questions, and they dove into that. So let's look at what is metabolism. Metabolism describes all the chemical processes that take place in your body to keep you alive. So we want to make sure, am I doing what I can do to get the right nutrition so I can live a long quality life? Anabolism, breaking down catabolism. So anabolism is the process of building and storing. An example is when your body takes the food you eat and uses it to build organs, bone, and muscle. This process can be involving building proteins from smaller amino acid units, building glucose from carbon dioxide molecules, building lipids from fatty acids joined by glycerol molecules. Your body uses these larger molecules to maintain body tissues, grow new cells, and store energy. Takes energy for these anabolic processes to work. Now, the opposite is catabolism, which we don't want to be too much in, but Goldilocks effect for everything. Nothing's bad, it's just the right amount. So catabolic processes break down proteins, carbs, lipids, release energy, generating ATP from nutrients. ATP is where we talk about our energy currency. So the balance between energy intake and energy expenditure determines your energy stores. Energy metabolism works in your body every minute of the day. It's a very root of your body to survive, but if it's not efficient. So as I've gone over when I do metabolic testing, we can see how much fat you're burning during exercise as well as at rest, and looking at your different fuel sources. When we're doing exercise timing, we'll look at this in our podcast with Dr. Mickey, looking at how to fuel for the exercise. But at rest, I want to be more efficient at burning fat, but burning carbohydrates when needed, but be able to flex back to burning fat. So your BMR test that I do with Pinoe, what can impact that age? And that's what I keep telling people. suggesting, I don't tell, but suggest that you get your metabolism tested, because what happens as we get older, our metabolism gets slower. What can you do to improve your metabolism? It's what you eat, how you exercise, how you sleep, how you manage your stress. So yes, BMR, basal metabolic rate, can be impacted, influenced by age, hormones, genetics, body weight, body comp. Having more lean tissues, higher metabolism. How do you get lean tissue? Strength training, physical activity, sleep pattern, stress. So I call this the holistic method. We're working on all this to figure out what works best for you to improve the aging process, to increase your metabolism. So the efficiency of your metabolic rate may affect your metabolic flexibility and wellness. So healthy lifestyle decisions isn't just what you eat or how you train, but also the sleep and the stress really impact that as well as your hormone balance. So it's all impacted. Okay, so let's scroll down. Metabolic health. No standard definition, but people describe it as the absence of metabolic syndrome. And you can read more there, but what are the 5 conditions to metabolic syndrome? High blood pressure, high blood sugar, abdominal obesity, abnormal cholesterol, high triglyceride levels. Now, you can see my podcast I did with Wild Health. What cholesterol markers should we look at? Is it total cholesterol, LDL, HDL? That's kind of the old way to do it. We want to look at other markers as LP little a, APOB, and your particle size of LDL. So if you have if you have 3 or more of these risk factors, this may lead you to be more metabolic syndrome symptoms and a diagnosis of metabolic syndrome. Now, if you have metabolic syndrome, higher risk for it, that increases the risk for heart disease, diabetes, and stroke. So we want to be metabolically healthy. All right, so what is metabolic flexibility? Glucose can read more metabolically inflexible. Your glucose are going to likely rise higher than normal and stay higher longer than they should in certain situations. Metabolic flexibility allows for improved energy efficiency, supporting optimal glucose regulation and energy metabolism. So what is the connection between metabolic flexibility and insulin resistance? You can go into that on this article from NutriSense. But let's look at the best example. When you are metabolically inflexible, you're more likely to experience glucose oxidation. If you continue to have high glucose over long term, your pancreas has to produce more insulin to manage the increase of glucose. The cells that make insulin in your pancreas then become overworked and dysfunctional. So that's why I always say everything too much can become dysfunctional, overused. And that includes cortisol, insulin, glucose. Over time, your cells start to ignore the persistent insulin signal and stop removing excess glucose from your blood. Impaired insulin stimulated glucose metabolism is linked to diabetes. All right, so continue on. Great article. What to do, track your glucose, focus on your diet, helping you improve metabolic flexibility, getting the right type of fiber, feeding your microbiome, avoiding standard American diet, energy requirements. That's what we do with my metabolism testing, getting the right type of exercise. So good article to dive into, as well as sleep, stress, recovery. So another article found at athleticinsight.com. What is fat adapted? So fat adapted means what? Transitions from carbohydrate dominant energy state to one where fat, dietary store become the main fuel source. The purpose, being fat adapted, carbohydrates are your backup tank. Limited supply of fat is more extensive reservoir. So by being fat adapted, the body is tapping into these fast reserves, ensuring the sustained energy without frequent up and down of blood sugar. So being fat adapted, you'll have more stable blood sugar, and you can use that with NutriSense using their glucose monitor or levels and measuring as with Lumen to find out you're burning fat or not. So fat adaptation, around athletes is what we're talking about today with Dr. Mickey. Sustained energy is vital. Being fat adapted can be a game changer, tapping into mass reserves of fat. Avoid going to the dreaded wall when glycogen runs out. Excuse me. So fat adaptation, there's a process. We talk about an Endure IQ program, but what are the signs of your fat adapted? I think it's more steady energy, not having hunger all throughout the day, craving carbs, those cravings diminish, mental clarity and focus. We don't have the high and low glucose. How long does it take? 4 to 6 weeks. That's going to depend. And women, you can match it with your cycle. How long to see the results? So you can read about that in this article. So another one to look at is what we're talking with Dr. Mickey, this metabolic efficiency, metabolic crossover point when we're doing your testing, as with canoeing metabolic testing. Where is that metabolic crossover point where this, right about here, your carbohydrate usage goes above fat and kind of goes back and forth, but more so here. And what is it? Heart rate, for this example, 133. So we can see, can we make this higher by the way we're training in this zone too, so that improves. So we look at metabolic crossover study that they did at S Fuels, fat oxidation rate, 70% energy from carbs versus 80% energy from fat. So working on your fueling as an endurance athlete, different than a CrossFit athlete, we're training for going longer. So you're doing Ironman, so you're just doing 10 to 12 hours exercise, but you want to be efficient at burning fat. So you're avoiding that high and low blood sugar, those crashes, the GI stress, all the things that happens when you're burning mostly carbs when you're doing long distance. So we talked about how to implement carb periodization to your training. So this is an article from Dr. Dan Plu's Right Fuel, Right Time that I like to share with clients, carbohydrate manipulation. So summary here, restrict carb intake around and during lower intensity activity as zone 1 and 2. This is low glycolytic demand, so you're burning mostly fat. Number 2, summary here, don't be afraid to ingest carbs during long sessions when you're going over 1.5 to 2 hours, targeting at improving your fat oxidation, fat ox. This will help extend the duration of those sessions. So we're being able to stay down here. So the yellow gold color is fat. So we want to get this fat burning up higher for this client training down here. So number 3, during long tempo sessions where intensity is clamped. So this is going to be more zone 3 and 4 when you're doing these different sets. More adaptation gained by restricting carbohydrate before you work out, starting the session with lower muscle glycogen. And then you're fueling more intense sessions with a few extra carbs to support training quality, maximize the stimulus for adaptation. So when you have overall calories, you want to make sure you're not low energy availability, but getting enough calories in. And the days when you're having lower carb intake, make sure you're not skipping calories. So this is a chart I was going over with Dr. Mickey. If you're doing endurance training, make sure that meal, if you're doing an early morning session, is 6 in the morning, making sure you ate dinner 12 hours beforehand, that you're having some protein, healthy fats, and some carbohydrates from nature as your potatoes. And then 1 hour pre-workout, you might have a little protein, healthy fats, as we talked about doing fat, coffee with some whey protein in it. During the workout itself, when you're doing endurance zone 2, long sustained distance, fat-based fuels, electrolytes until 120 minutes. So when you're going over 2 hours, then you can add in some carbohydrates because it won't raise your glucose, insulin, because you are exercising. That carbohydrate is going to be pulled into your muscle once you are exercising. So that's why we wait until you're in your training so you can activate that GLUT4 transport system and get the carbohydrates eaten into your muscles to be used as fuel. Because remember, you are burning, always see this is purple, you always are burning some carbohydrates down here. It's not that you're all fat, there's some of each. That is individual tests, but so we want to work on improving how long we can go, how hard, how many watts you can burn by how you train, but then also working on your fueling. So if you're doing a tempo specific, say Ironman workout, or you're doing a run, bike workout that you're adding in some higher zones, that's going to change your fuel source. So great chart you can find on NGRIQ, right fuel, right time, carbohydrate manipulation to make every session count. So it doesn't mean zero carbs, but we're putting them in the workout. Other article I have from Right Fuel, Right Time, carb manipulation was the same, looking at high carb, low carb diet and what is the right fuel to have, and having that improvement in the fat oxidation by how you train, but knowing how you can implement. So that's the same article, but just looking at different chart on there. Looking at what resistant starches are, looking at what are some starchy foods to add that might be good for your gut, your microbiome. So looking at what that is, we can go into another article, foods that contain resistant starch, plantains, green bananas. I don't personally like beans, peas, and lentils, but that has to be properly prepared, so soaked and sprouted. And I don't agree with whole grains. Oats and barley don't work for most of my clients because I do their wheat Zoomer tests. Most people are not able to digest this properly. The gliadin part in gluten and cross-reactivity with gluten can cause leaky gut by activating zonulin, and it breaks down your gut wall lining. So your gut barrier is broken. So other options are cooked and cooled rice. Pasta is not great because, again, it's gluten. For most people, it's gluten-free, but potatoes cooked and cooled. So those are resistant starches. So keeping the blood sugar stable with that, but you're supporting gut health. And that is article here to go into. If you want to know more, listen to my podcast. I did on short chain fatty acids, how they help keep your intestinal lining strong. Is that mucus barrier that we have. Think about in your nose, as I'm congested today with allergies, that your gut wall lining has a mucosal slimy barrier there. You want to improve that with that green tea and having the glutamine and having omega fatty acids, but also getting the right foods to feed the microbiome, help support Akkermansia bacteria and other things. So looking at short chain fatty acids, good side note to look at, but resistant starches. And then we're talking too about another article from Dr. Dan Plews about how many carbs per hour. And that's a big topic of what is the right amount for you. And he talks about doing the 60 grams an hour, not more than, say, this chart says 90. Because if I look at Morton gels, this one, the gel, Sports Fuel Gel 100 from Morton, has 25 grams of carbohydrates from sugars. And that's good instant fuel versus there's Vitargo I was looking at. What does that have? It's a carbohydrate, high molecular weight, low osmolality, very low tendency to track water out of tissues, so you might not have the bloating versus others. So looking at this carbohydrate fuel source from Vitargo versus fuel of Martin gel. So that's the gel 100, but they have a fuel guide here you can look at if you're looking at how to fuel. And they have different training sessions. You can look at Morton Fuel, but I'm finding this makes you go on the blood sugar roller coaster. So general fueling, cycling, running, how to combine products. I am about improving your fat burning for that zone 2 workouts, fuel appropriately when you're doing a tempo zone 3, when you're doing intervals, higher intensity zone 4, when you're working up here doing sprint interval training, how to fuel for those. So that's why we're talking today with S fuels, and how if you are an endurance athlete, their research is based on endurance athletes, not other sports as CrossFit. So you want to look at long distance training, zone 2. Zone 3 is more low tempo race pace, ultra full Ironmans race pace. Upper tempo training is going to be a half full marathon, 70.3 or 100 race pace. So your upper tempo is zone 4, low tempo zone 3, and then sprint interval training would be zone 5. So they created this new formulation of their fueling to make it less confusing. And I think it's really brilliant. So zone 2, you can add in this fuel per hour. When you're doing more of this higher intensity, higher tempo pace work, begin 30 minutes after starting training, 1 serve per hour. And then afterwards or before training, you can do a shake or a bar if you want fuel. And then how to improve fat oxidation, race focus. You're doing S fuels primed as an example, having some coffee or caffeine rather. Drink fuel zone 4 or zone 5. You're doing the fuel zone 4, gel is in the zone 5 fuel. And it explains how to mix depending on your race. And then if you're doing primed, that's a caffeine, and you add that in with your fuel. So you can mix it up, but again, always individualize this and test and not guess in your training. Don't do anything new race day. But before racing, maybe you have a prime, and then maybe you're having this S during your race, or you're going really shorter distance, going all out, maybe add a little bit of this gel, having part of it throughout. So this is a great chart if you are doing a 70.3 or 100 triathlon recipe, strong aerobic base, optimize aerobic adaptation, build gut resiliency. We talked to Dr. Mickey about stable, high intensity finishes. If you want to finish strong and you're racing, not just trying to finish, you might need some higher intensity fuel. And then fueling right, so you're getting the right ingredients so you keep your gut healthy. So examples on this chart, what to eat the night before or the 2 days before that. Resistant starch, make cooked and cooled potatoes, rice, sweet potato, having a little bit of berries, what's in season, organic, and then avoiding alcohol, dessert, juices, sodas, ice cream, caffeine. And then they talk about race morning, what you could do. Again, it's kind of timing and practicing this, and during the race, examples what to do if it's a 70.3. Now, what if you're going a little longer, like an Ironman distance or a 100-mile race? Maybe you're looking at race morning, during the race. So there's some examples. They're looking at half marathon. Here's some examples. Race morning, during the race. Let's shrink that up. So you can look at these examples. I just think it's a great way to organize this. Night before, if you're doing like Zach does, ultras, 100 miles, what should you do? Real food before, race morning. Maybe you're having food, real food, maybe some granola. I like my probiotic super gut yogurt. Maybe you're having a bar as S fuels, or I like Laird's. And then during the race, how to get some nice steady blood sugar support of some carbs put in there while you're having S fuels, zone 2, and then you're getting into zone 4 when you're racing. So this is where we have to individualize it, right? So everyone's different. If you're just finishing the race, or are you racing the race? Are you doing high heart rate? Where are you going to be in what zone? And how are you going to maybe start pacing yourself here? You're going to pick it up and be at the top part, especially the weather conditions will change it. So I just thought it was great to share. Dr. Mickey and I on our video, you can watch, went through this. And then zone 4 fuel from S fuels. And then there's zone 5. And then they're primed as little caffeine. And test it out. If it works, Revivals, their protein and their life bars. And I always look at the ingredients. Do these agree with you? Not everyone can do almonds. And there's syrups from tapioca, cocoa butter, cocoa nibs. I don't do all stevia and monk fruit, so I can't do everything with stevia leaf. I'm better with just real sugar. So you have to read the ingredients, see if that works for you, and find something that does work for you. If you can't do corn, so you have to always look at, okay, this sounds great, but what are the ingredients? So look down. Yes, it's grain-free, gluten-free, but what are these ingredients? Are they okay for you? Because I find stevia is reactive in a lot of people. Monk fruit extract, I don't do well with either. So remember to read the ingredients, test them out. Don't do anything new race day. But that was just a great example. So you can find all these references on S Fuel's website. And then again, going back to enduriq.com blogs to figure out the fuel source for you. And I've got this fly in here. So, depending on what intensity you're doing, your duration, time of day. So if you're working out first thing in the morning, or you starting at 9 or 10 in the morning or afternoon, that will change your nutrient timing, your meal timing. and then having post-workout, maybe a shake that's easy to digest, and then have high protein meal when you're able to sit down and actually eat real food and chew and digest it properly once you're in parasympathetic rest and digest stage. And then knowing what each zone benefits are. So it's an important part. So yes, there's lots of articles on here improving your metabolic effect. You're not reducing fat oxidation. What is the right amount for carbs? So looking at this article is pretty good from Dan Plu's summary carbs per hour, no more than 90. Right? So the response down here, large carb intake during exercise can not be good for you. So Dr. Dan Plu says, interpretation of the data, ingesting carbs at rate more than 90 grams per hour during competition is a risk not worth taking. Carb intake up to 90 grams per hour reduces the rate at which we may use our glycogen stores to power exercise, which is super useful during Ironman. However, increasing carb intake at rates 120 grams per hour fails to further ease the burden on our glycogen stores. In fact, increases the burden perhaps by simply accumulating in the gut, where likely threatens to cause nasty GI symptoms. So you can see the more gut issues, the higher carbs, because you're not using that fuel, so it's just sitting there. So when you're looking at other fuels, there's UCAN, there's Vitargo, looking at the science of it. You can read about it, but how much carbohydrate can you take? How much fuel do you need an hour and electrolytes, but how does that absorb? I'm not saying this is bad. I'm just saying, make sure you test what works best for you and what fuel source is going to work. So there's Vitargo, muscle goes into your muscle, they say, versus maltodextrin sugars, placebo. But again, looking at the science, and then shopping, looking at the ingredients, gluten-free, and then say they have group packages. Then I look at, all right, does this work for my client? What is in it? Vitargo, where are the ingredients? Reading what you're trying to take, figuring out what works best for you is going to be different. So, and how to use it, 1 scoop, empty stomach, during workouts, lasting longer, 60 to 90 minutes, refueling every 45 to 60. Hourly carb gram is need personalized carb calculator. So I think figuring out how much you can take. So having too much, what do they suggest? 1 scoop, youth versus elite, and then looking at that. So I would do your research if you're trying to figure out what fuel to use for your racing training. This is Morton gels. And yeah, can you do this higher amount, or do you want to stick with the carbohydrates lower and not have GI stress? So what is your gut able to do? What intensity are you doing? So remember, what pace are you training for or racing at? Are you burning mostly fat and some carbs that you don't need to have all this up here? So maybe you just need a little dose of, say, 25 grams of carbs. If you don't want a gel, then you have pieces of bar, but looking at articles of how improving your fat oxidation, athlete A up here, athlete B, looking at high fat burner versus moderate fat burner, right? Athlete A is likely to make more use of fat at higher rates than a B during sessions. So if we're looking at this test, improving fat oxidation and getting higher watts, you're burning more fat at higher intensities, so you're putting more watts out, you want to get tested. So that is the article last year, making sense of exercise test fat oxidation. So looking at how much can you improve your fat usage, fat oxidation rate. Again, the athlete B decreasing watts versus athlete A, kind of steady. So in summary, fat oxidation measured during tests performed at overnight fast tells you athletes' capacity to metabolize fat during exercise. tells you athletes likely to burn fat, low, moderate, high rates during real world training competition. They don't tell you exactly what an athlete's going to burn fat during real world, right? So if we look at my testing, this is a test this one was on a stationary bike, others are on a treadmill. What happens when you're outside? What happens when it's windy? What happens if it's humid, dry, you're dehydrated? So this is just in a lab setting, remember? So when we're trying to figure out your fuel plan, training, racing out real life, you have to remember, we have to make sense of it. It's going to be different outside versus inside. So there's kind of guesstimates. That's why it depends what person is, how they're feeling in training and all that. So just want to touch more. What are good strategic carbs? What are some good real food sources? There's lots of research links on the references on S fuels. I think that's a handy guide to have. And you can look on that. Whoops, page up. And if you have more questions, just let me know and we'll dive into this a little more. Nikki and I talked about going into protein next. So I'd love that to have her on and talk about protein. So watch my video with Dr. Mickey and with Stephanie Holbrook if you're endurance athletes trying to figure out what is right, carbs, fat, protein. You are unique. So let's personalize your program and figure out what works best for you. Trial and error, test and not guess when you can. And then functional lab testing help test food sensitivities, a wheat zoomer, microbiome stool, gut test if you have any overgrowth pathogens, yeast overgrowth, all that. And then working on micronutrient testing if you can too helps. So let me know if you have any questions. Head to debbiepotts.net and send me a note.